So the final period in Greek history that we're going to be looking at and discussing is the Hellenistic period. So Hellenistic refers to, when we're talking about Greek culture and history, essentially a period that begins with Alexander the Great's conquest of ancient Greece. And this period begins, we talk about this starting at 323 BCE. So during the Hellenistic period, of course, we have some major shifts in terms of culture, politics. One of the things that changes pretty dramatically is that the centers really of Greek Hellenistic culture are no longer really in the Greek mainland. So Athens, some other capitals and places there that we've talked about in the past are no longer really central, as compared anyway to some of the places that we see in Asia Minor, like, for example, Pergamon. Ephesus is another important place as well. During this period in history, we also see that the style in which sculpture is rendered changes pretty dramatically. Sculpture tends to shift, and rather than the intense idealism and realism that we see within the classical period, we shift to something a little bit different. The sculpture during the Hellenistic, it focuses much more on kind of down-to-earth plebeian figures in many cases, or very dramatic content, sometimes very emotional subjects. And we also see that in many cases, the favored subject, rather than being these kind of idealized and perfected warriors and heroes, instead become kind of everyday common people and Greeks. So that shifts, that changes quite a bit, and we'll be looking at examples of that as we move through. The first artwork that we're going to be looking at here is kind of a fun one. This is a bust, a surviving sculptural bust. And this is actually believed to be an original and not a copy, like many of the works that we look at from this period are. But this one is believed to be a rendition of Alexander the Great from Pella. So again, this is quite possibly an accurate representation of Alexander. We don't know for sure, but the image that we have here, the representation of the features, appear pretty close to what the historical documents describe. So we may, in this particular image here, be looking on the face of Alexander the Great. One of the art forms that we also look at during this period is Greek mosaic. Again, as we've talked about, we don't have a lot of surviving Greek painting, which isn't much that remains. But we do have some examples of mosaic that we can look at and discuss that might give us a little bit of a better idea of how the Greeks would have represented things in a two-dimensional format. We know that many of the mosaics that we have that do survive are highly detailed. We have very, very small tessera, which are the small stones which are used in order to make up the structure itself and lay out the different forms and colors. And they're often focused on historical or mythological content. One of the most famous of these, we can see this next image here, is a work that represents the battle of Alexander the Great and Darius II. And this is also, unfortunately, a Roman copy, but it's believed to be a pretty good copy. So this one's actually from Pompeii. And Pompeii is a Roman city we'll talk about later that was buried by a volcanic eruption in 79 AD. But this mosaic is believed to be probably late 2nd or early 1st century BCE, so it's pretty old. And the original, which would have been created by a man by the name of Philoxenus of Eretria, was made in 310 BCE. So this is a Tesoro Mosaic copy. It's about 8'10" by 16'9", so it's quite large. But it represents this amazing scene. And if we look carefully there, we can actually see Alexander on the left-hand side. And at the moment, he's got a spear which is running right through one of Darius's immortals, his personal guard. But even so, he's focusing on Darius. You know, he's got Darius in his sights, so to speak. And as this is all happening, if you look at Darius there, his chariot is actually turning around. They're running him around here. He's getting ready to flee, even though he's reaching out towards Alexander. But the level of detail in here is just tremendous. The sense of space. We even see things like reflections of people in shields. And so the level of detail here and the intensity of the representation is really quite astonishing. So architecture during the Hellenistic period is a little bit different than what we've seen previously to this too. Some of the temples that are made during the Hellenistic period are just enormous. They're huge. Some of them are much larger than a lot of earlier examples. They do also start to kind of break away from the traditional formats that we see when we look at the Parthenon or the Temple of Hera II or Temple of Apphia at Aegina. We start to see that the format shifts and changes to some more creative things, if you will. And again, some of the best examples of these can be found, or were found anyway, at the site of Pergamon and Ephesus. As we'll talk about a little later here, one of the best known of these temples has actually been relocated. So this is an example of a theater. And a theater is a really kind of interesting and important Greek innovation. So when the Greeks created a theater, they did it using the natural landscape to their advantage. They would find a location where there was a hollow area, kind of framed by hills, and create this structure. The term they would use for hollow places, cavea, which is also synonymous in this case with auditorium, and this would often sit into a hillside. Here, this example is from Epidaurus, and it's created using a series of wedge-shaped benches, which are also called cunei. The plural for this is cuneus. And it's quite a large auditorium. It's about 387 feet in diameter. There's 55 rows of seats. It would have held somewhere around 12,000 people. And there's some other terms here, by the way, that you might be familiar with. There's a word that we use frequently today in English. The term is orchestra. And for us, this refers to a specific type of musical ensemble, stringed instruments generally. But in this case, the word comes from really the hard-packed earth here in the center. And this was known as the orchestra, which literally translates as the dancing place. Another term here that we also can talk about is the theatron, which is the place for seeing. And this was essentially the seating area where the spectators would sit and oversee the orchestra so they could watch and observe the play or whatever else that they were seeing take place. There's a word here that we see that we've talked about in the past. When we talked about the ancient Mycenaeans, you may recall we talked a little bit about a Tholos tomb, specifically the one that's frequently called the treasury of Atreus, the beehive tomb. Well, a Tholos really refers to a circular plan, and when we're talking about the Greek world, the Tholos refers to a circular temple. And so this is an example here of one of these Tholos temples. This one was from Delphi, originally designed by Theodoros. And this would have held sacred snakes for the healing god. And the structure now is obviously in ruins, but it would have been framed with Doric columns. But then on the interior, we actually had Corinthian columns. Now we haven't actually talked about Corinthian before. We'll see an example of those in just a moment. But the Corinthian is really essentially a modification of the Ionic order with a different capital. But other than that, the orders are really identical. So here we can see an elevation view of essentially a Corinthian order, and we can see that it's quite similar. You've got the architrave, the frieze, the cornice. Obviously, they're composed of the same elements. You have the dentils along in the cornice there, but the difference really is, of course, the capital. And rather than using the volutes that we see traditionally with the Ionic, instead we see acanthus leaves. So here we have an example of a capital on remaining part of a column here. This is from a Tholos at Epidaurus, designed by Polykleitos the Younger. And we can again see what this looks like with the acanthus leaves curling up here. And again, otherwise this would have been virtually identical to the Ionic order. The next example here is kind of an interesting example of architecture. This is the choragic monument of Lysicrates from Athens from about 334 BCE. And this is not really a building. It's actually solid. It's filled in. But it is one of the earliest known uses of the Corinthian column on the exterior of a building. And this is a monument that was erected by Lysicrates to commemorate the victory of a chorus that he sponsored in a theatrical contest. So it resembles a Tholos, but it's really kind of a giant trophy more than anything else. And the columns here are not freestanding, but they are in fact what we call engaged columns. So these are columns that aren't really a full column, but are instead attached to a wall. So let's go back for a moment, though, and talk about Athens again here. We've had an opportunity to kind of really talk about the fact that during this period in history, much of the focus is really going to be on places like Epidaurus and Pergamon, but we still have a couple things here we want to look at from back in the old area of Greece that we talked about when we looked at classical and earlier periods. And one of the things that's really important for us to talk about when we go back and look at Athens is something called the Agora. So an agora is a town center, a civic center, really. And this is an important part of the city. And an agora is something you would find in lots of these Greek cities. These were kind of a common place. This is kind of akin, really, to the Roman Forum. And you would sometimes find around these a structure called a stoa. A stoa is a large colonnaded structure, which, in the case of the one at Athens, was actually rebuilt by the American School of Classical Studies. It was originally actually paid for by the king of Pergamon. So here's kind of our attachment here, our connection back to Pergamon here. The king of Pergamon had studied in Athens as a youth and had commissioned to have this structure created there in Athens. And so if we look at the next image here, this is what we're actually talking about. This is the Stoa of Delos II. And again, this is a Stoa, which really is, for all intents and purposes, a Greek shopping mall. So this is a place where you would go to buy a variety of different goods. And this would face out against the Agora, again, which is a town center. And so again, this one was reconstructed, rebuilt by the American School of Classical Studies, but it's really an interesting example. And it's one of the earlier examples that we tend to see of an interesting combination of orders. The bottom story here uses Doric columns, but then the second story, the upper level here, uses Ionic. And this is something, by the way, that we'll see the Romans really become quite fond of. And structures like the Colosseum, for example, will utilize a variety of different orders of architecture that shift and change vertically as you move through the structure. So probably one of the most famous of all the buildings that we'll be talking about when we look at Hellenistic Greece is a building known as the Altar of Zeus. So this is a structure, a building that was located in Pergamon, which is in Turkey, was created around 175 BCE. And this was part of an acropolis, really a large, beautiful, complex acropolis at the city of Pergamon. But the site itself was really in ruins, and it is in ruins still today. But interestingly, this particular object, this temple here, no longer resides in Turkey. The entire temple, the whole thing, has been relocated to Germany, and that's where it is today. So it's actually found inside in Berlin now. If you were to go and see it today, that's where you'd find it. The kingdom of Pergamon that we see in the coast of Turkey there was created in the early 3rd century with the breakup of Alexander's empire. On the death of the last king of Pergamon, which was Attalus III, the kingdom really was bequeathed to the Roman Empire, and so became a Roman possession. And on that same Acropolis, by the way, where we would have found this, we also find a temple to Trajan. So this kind of makes a little bit of sense when you look at it in that context. But this is probably famous not only just for being a temple, but it's also famous as really the most famous of all of the Hellenistic sculptural ensembles. There's an enormous frieze, 400 foot long, with over 100 life-size figures that represents, of course, gigantomachy. And so we tend to see that as being one of these very popular subjects. And like we saw at Athens, in this case, the gigantomachy is symbolic. It's not just about really celebrating the victory of the gods over the giants. It's showing the victory of the Pergamons, in this case, over the Gauls. And so, while it is, again, metaphorical, we do also see examples of sculpture from the site here that are not metaphorical, but are really showing Gallic barbarians being defeated by Greeks. And we'll look at those here in a little bit as well. But again, and this relates to history, because King Attalus I had defeated the Gallic barbarians in Asia Minor. And so really, this is kind of a traditional Greek thing here to use these traditional images of gigantomachy or amazonomachy or centauromachy, and use these as a way to kind of create a metaphor for showing some sort of victory or conquest by the Greek people themselves. So this is a plan view of the Acropolis there at Pergamon, and you can get some idea roughly of what the structure would have looked like. You can see on the kind of on our left up there, up towards the top, you can see the shape, the bracket there that would have been the altar of Zeus. Smaller temple over on your right-hand side, you can see the temple to Trajan. And there's also a shape there you can see which is quite obviously a theater, and this was really kind of a central component. Below that we have a series of temples and other structures, including possibly a stable and a variety of other elements. So the image we're looking at here is an example from the Gigantomachy frieze from the altar of Zeus at Pergamon. And again, this one today can be found in Berlin. It's 7'6" in height. So these figures are really essentially life-size. And here we have Athena grabbing onto the hair of one of the giants, the giant Alcyoneos. And Nike flies in from the side to crown her victorious. And this is, of course, a relief sculpture, but it is done with a tremendous depth. These figures are almost freestanding, and it's incredibly powerful and dramatic. If we look at this and compare it with an earlier example of Gigantomachy, here we have a Gigantomachy frieze, which is from the Siphian treasury at Delphi. And then above on top here, we again have our example from Pergamon. You can see the differences here. So they're really quite astounding. You can see the much greater depth of carving, the intensity of the motion, and the action going on really in the more recent frieze that we see from Pergamon. So in addition to these metaphorical friezes that we see that represent Gigantomachy, we also have some much more literal examples. The image we're looking at here was more than likely created by a well-known artist by the name of Epidaurus. And this is not an original, though. It is a marble copy. The original here would have been bronze and located at Pergamon. But this copy is quite large. It's about 6'11" in height. And it represents really, well, kind of a suicide. This shows a Gallic chieftain who has just killed his wife and is now killing himself. And he's doing this rather than be captured, rather than suffer defeat at the hands of the Greeks. He is taking his own life and that of his wife rather than surrender. This was probably the centerpiece of a group which were placed there on the temple and depicted this very literal victory over the Gauls. This was an earlier example of statuary there at Pergamon. It was replaced eventually by images that referred to the Gigantomachy, and so really cut to the same concept, but did it in a slightly more roundabout way. The wife, of course, here would have been sold into slavery had she survived, which is kind of his rationale for slaying her and then himself. But you have this incredibly twisted posture, this intense emotionalism here, and that's really typical of this Pergamon style, this Hellenistic style that we see here in this late period of Greek art. Another really famous work, also from this sculptural ensemble, and also likely by Epidaurus, is referred to simply as the Dying Gaul. And again here we're looking at a Roman copy, as the original Greek bronze no longer survives. But it's interesting when we look at this. We can see that the sculptor here is very accurately representing this individual. He's even represented with the racial characteristics and traits that we'd expect to see in someone of Gallic descent. So he doesn't look like one of these kind of simplified, schematic, earlier figures we might expect, but instead here he's got a lot of elements here that refer to who he is culturally. And he's shown in this dying moment here, really, with blood pouring out of a gash in his chest. These Gauls are always shown as powerful warriors. They're not shown as weak. And this is intended to show that defeating them was certainly a challenge and not something that came easily. So, one of the most famous sculptures from this period really has got to be this image here of Nike. And this is the Nike of Samothrace from Greece, and it is quite large. Even without her head, she's 8'1" in height. And today you would find this located in the Louvre in Paris. So, also interestingly, a lot of people don't realize that this particular statue here is part of a larger ensemble, really. She would have been originally perched on top of a ship. But she's shown here in motion with her wings beating back, her garments whipping in the wind, and had this tremendous sense of power and movement, and we also still get a feeling for this dramatic figure underneath all of this clothing. Here in this image you can see a little bit more of the original statue, including some of the remains of the boat. This would have been part again of a fountain, so water would have been splashing up against the base of the boat and created a much more dramatic effect than we see today. If we compare this to a classical example, we can look here at the Dory by Polykleitos, and you can see how it differs. Again, we have this tremendous sense of motion, of movement, of power, and you can see how strict and how stoic the earlier work that here by Polykleitos appears in contrast to the example that we see here. So another quite well-known example from the period, this is a work by Alexandros of Antioch on the Meander. And this is, of course, Aphrodite. And this statue is popularly known, of course, as Venus de Milo. But this is really an inaccurate description because it's Greek, so it wouldn't be Venus. It's a Roman term. But instead it is Aphrodite. Now, she's obviously been damaged here. She's lost a couple of arms, but she still has quite a bit of appeal. In this case, she's much more overt in terms of the erotic and sexual nature of the pose here compared to earlier examples. But at this point in time, really, it was fairly common to see images of Aphrodite nude, but in this case, what the sculptor does is he doesn't leave her completely naked. Instead, it's this kind of teasing image where she, her garment, her clothing here is just kind of slipping off, and so it's actually really quite a bit more engaging in that respect. One of her hands would have originally held an apple, by the way, that would have been awarded to her by Paris when he had judged her to be the most beautiful of all of the goddesses. If we compare this and contrast it here to the, again, kind of rather poor example that we have of Aphrodite of Neto by Praxiteles, again, because it's coupled together from several Roman copies. But we still get a definite idea of the differences between these two. I don't think there's any question that the Hellenistic version here, this example again here of Aphrodite on the left, is really much more sensual, even though she's more fully clothed than the example on the right. And this just shows really the artist's skill in rendering the figure and in conveying this kind of sensuous posture. So from the serious sensuality and eroticism of Venus de Milo, we can move on to something that is really just kind of goofy. This is an image here of Aphrodite, Eros, and Pan from Delos. And it's smaller than life size, only about 4'4". But this is kind of a strange image. Hellenistic art has this tendency, sometimes when we talk about Hellenistic sculpture, we see sculptural works that sometimes show a really strong emotional content, or again show these plebeian figures, and sometimes they are really focused on sexuality. And there are some figures in particular that we won't be showing in this video because some of them are really probably not appropriate for our intended age level and audience. But this one is a little bit interesting here. We have kind of a parody, really, of Aphrodite of Neto. We have this statue that's kind of mimicking that posture. But here she's being kind of accosted by a satyr, in this case by Pan. And so she's kind of whacking at him with a sandal and trying to kind of half-heartedly push him away while her son Eros pulls on his horns in an attempt to defend his mother from his lecherous advances. So this one's kind of a slightly different take on the whole concept of Aphrodite, and one that is quite in keeping to some extent with some of the Hellenistic sensibilities that we see. So here we move on to something that's really quite different. This is the seated boxer from Rome, and dates to roughly 100 to 50 BCE. So this Hellenistic sculpture here still, it really has an example of the type of subject that we might expect to see when we're looking at classical Greek, and that it is an athlete. And it's a little different, though, in terms of how it's handled. If this same subject, the same character, had been represented during the classical period, he would be idealized and perfected. But this is Hellenistic, so things are a little different. He's shown here as an older man. He's weathered, he's beaten, his nose is broken, his teeth are broken, we have copper blood running from gashes on his face, his ears are cauliflowered from years of boxing. He may have been part of a sculptural group, we don't really know, and may have been looking up at a man who beat him. We don't really know exactly. But rather than just this kind of blatant idealism here, we instead are seeing a much more realistic representation of this athlete. If we look at this side by side with a classical example here with the Riace warrior, we can get an idea of really how different these really are. There's a lot of similarities in terms of the figures that we're looking at, but the overall handling of these, one being in a much more realistic, a much more natural sense, and then the other being the earlier idealized classical Greek example. So one of the best examples we can look at in terms of Hellenistic Greek statuary that really shows us how it addresses these much more commonplace, down-to-earth figures can be seen here in a statue simply referred to as the Old Market Woman, dating to roughly 150 to 100 BCE. And it's also quite small. It's only about 4 foot and 1/2 inches in height. But during the Hellenistic period, interestingly, we see that a fairly common subject is people from really the lowest rungs of the social order. And this is a woman here who is carrying vegetables to the market, probably to sell. And she's doing this because she has no choice. She doesn't want to do this, but she's just kind of struggling with this heavy basket. She's bent with age and infirmity, but conveys this concept again of humanism and realism. Another example can be seen here of Greek Hellenistic realism. When we look at this statue here of Demosthenes, Demosthenes was a man of great moral conviction. In fact, he died. He had to drink poison rather than repudiate his beliefs. But here he's showing really this sense of loss, this sense of anguish at the loss of democracy to the hands of the invading Macedonians. And so instead of having him shown displayed as this heroic, muscular figure, he's shown as kind of a frail older man. And this, again, is one of the typical characteristics we can expect to see here when we talk about Hellenistic statuary, as contrasted with the idealism, again, of the classical period. So as we've discussed in the past, the ancient Romans were quite interested in Greek art. And we often see examples of Greek artworks that are commissioned by Roman patrons, and then, of course, created for various functions and uses in mainland, in Italy and Rome. The example we're looking at here is a great, case in point. This is a very famous statuary group called Laquan and Sons. Laquan was a Trojan priest, and he had tried to warn the Trojans about the Trojan horse. And Poseidon sets a series of sea serpents on Laquan and his kids and slays them before they can warn anyone. And so that's what we see going on here, is this moment of anguish and pain and struggle as they're being attacked by these serpents. But this is a very famous sculptural group. It was created by Athenodorus, Hagisandros, and Polydorus of Rhodes, who were Greek artists. But by this period in time, this was first century of the Common Era. And so while it's technically Greek, Greece was a Roman possession. Greece became a Roman province in 146 of BCE. And this particular example was discussed in history as being in the palace of Titus. And what's really kind of interesting is that during the Renaissance, it was dug up, it was found, and it was actually found in exactly the same place that the historian Pliny had described it. And this was, 14 centuries later. Another interesting little side note, by the way, the famous Renaissance artist Michelangelo was present when this was unearthed. And I think that you can sometimes see some of Michelangelo's sense of musculature and power when we look at this particular example. I think it had a fairly significant influence on him. So we'll look at some details here of Laquan and Sons, and you can get some idea, again, really, of the power of the statue. This image here, you can see it's actually been cleaned as compared to the previous slide, and you get some idea here, really, of the structure and the power here of the figures. It was pretty badly broken and at one point reassembled incorrectly, but has been since fixed. But some minor parts, little bits here and there, are still missing and non-existent. Here you can see again the one of Laquan's children with the snakes coiling around him. Another example here of the snake biting onto Laquan's thigh. And then finally here, something most people don't see often, the backside. This is the rear of the pedestal, and gives you some idea really kind of the back end of the sculptural group. So these sculptors, Athenodoros, Hagisandros, and Polydorus of Rhodes, in addition to this famous group that we're looking at here of Laquan and Sons, were also responsible for creating another very famous series of sculptural groups here. They created a group in Sperlonga, and this was at the summer residence of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. And they created this massive sculptural group showing the blinding of the Cyclops Polyphemus by Odysseus and his men. And this was considered to be one of the most impressive, one of the most important sculptural groups in all of antiquity. But unfortunately, very little of it survives. This here is one of the surviving components. This is an image here of Odysseus himself. And again, you can see that it has this tremendous sense of power. You have this emotional content carried, the wild nature of his hair. Again, it's a great example of what Hellenistic Greek sculpture is really all about.